Today I'm here with Zach Elliott, who is the founder of the Paradox Institute, which makes short videos explaining sex differences between men and women. And they are incredibly helpful if you're unsure about a lot of claims that are floating around right now coming from the gender identity ideology movement. And Zach, you are also the author of two books, I believe, right?
hmm
And one of which I have with me right now, The Gender Paradox. So, Zach, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me on.
And could we just start by, you telling us a little bit about how you got interested in this topic in sex and gender? I mean, you're an architecture student. So what originally was it that sort of drew you into this whole discussion?
I've always been really fascinated with biology and human psychology and understanding where we get our differences from, and also where our similarities are from too, as humans. And so, in architecture, there's a strong connection between psychology in terms of how people experience spaces, and also in terms of biology, uh, how we can adapt designs to biological principles, whether it's for creating more efficient energy use and things like that. And so there's really strong connections between biology and psychology and architecture. But while I was going through my architecture degree just a few years ago, it was around 2016, 2017, I started to see a lot of this science denialism in the culture regarding the biology of sex, and a lot of misinformation, a lot of uh, just I saw sleight of hand tricks, some gaslight, like things that were really affecting the culture big time. And I could see this cultural shift happening when it came to how people view sex. And I was really curious as to what was going on and what the actual research had to say about uh, not just the differences between males and females on a behavioral or psychological level, but also on the biological level in terms of reproductive systems and things like that.
Mhm.
And so in 2017, I started writing and researching, particularly just the literature on sex differences when it came to the body, when it came to behavior and psychology. And I really like synthesizing information together and learning that way. And so I started just doing some writing on my own and reading a lot of peer-reviewed science when it came to sex differences. And then uh, I wrote a short little book about just average sex differences in 2017. Continued to get more interested in it, and then in 2019, I wrote The Gender Paradox, and that was just a continual, even more, a deeper exploration of the biological differences and the psychological differences within men and women and between men and women. And then in the next year, in 2020, that's when I started the Paradox Institute. And I wanted to start it because I thought that we were really in need of clear scientific information that discussed the biology of sex in a way that was clear, easy to understand, and in a way that provided a lot of sources too. And so started doing those animated videos in 2020 and started posting on Twitter about the biology of sex. And then from there, it's just taken off. And I've gained so many really cool perspectives too from just a huge variety of people. It's changed the way I see the world in a big sense in terms of just uh, science and even the interactions between people. And it's been a great learning experience too. I've learned so much. And so um, since then, I've decided that I really want to pursue biology further in my education. And so from there, I'll probably, it looks like I will pursue a Master of Science in biology and then maybe specialize in a PhD somewhere. But that's where I got to where I am now.
Okay, great. Are you interested in a career in academia, or is that on your mind at all?
That is on my mind a little bit. I really like teaching others, and I've done presentations before where I get to like plan it out and give like a lecture about topics that I'm interested in, and I really enjoy that. So I think academia is one good option. I'm not totally on that path yet, or have decided, but I think that's one of the options that later down the road, I think I would definitely consider.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's pretty unusual that a person who doesn't isn't professional in this field would spend so much time sort of doing this research and compiling all these peer-reviewed studies. And what is it, I guess, in you that kind of makes you do that? Would you call
It's,
yourself an
yeah.
autodidact?
Yeah, would that be like a self-taught, yeah, like
Yeah.
multiple disciplines?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't know, are you a
mhm.
lay biologist, I guess, would that be fair to say?
Yeah, that might be fair to say, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm really incredibly curious just about the world and how things work. Um, and I really find that what's happening in the culture right now to be really disturbing to me in terms of the denial of just the basic biology, the denial of very objective categories in biology, like male and female. And so it was really uh, first, when I first started researching, it was a way to understand what's going on in the culture and be able to basically arm myself with knowledge to be able to respond. And then as I continued to research and do reading and writing, then I found a really, really strong passion in biology in a way that I didn't have before. So it just um, I think when you start to explore other topics, even in disciplines that you're not primarily getting an education in initially, you can really start to open up different avenues and ways of seeing the world and even new passions that you didn't have before. And I also love writing, and and so there's these different creative energies too that are fulfilled through that.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's why. Yeah.
And for your videos, do you do everything on your own, like all the editing and the graphic effects?
Yep, all the editing and the production, animation is all done by me, and
Okay.
and even the script writing. Yeah,
Yeah, they're
um,
very well put
it's
together. I think even
it,
your haters acknowledge how sleek they are.
I've yeah, it's funny. Uh, I've seen a few times where some of the haters will respond. They can't help but compliment it. They'll be like, "Well, these are some really slickly produced videos,"
Yeah.
and stuff like that. It's really funny.
It's silly
But
because
yeah,
it's almost like, oh, who's behind this? Like it can't be just something
yeah.
authentic. It's
There
like
was
slick.
there was some really interesting posts that I saw that were hilarious of people talking about, like, there was one on Reddit actually about the Paradox Institute and about me talking about how they were like, who is funding this guy? Like, what's going on? And it's like, well, no one's funding me. Like,
Yeah.
this is, I'm not like part of organization. It's completely independent.
Right.
It just, if you have the drive and the skills, you can accomplish things like that.
Yeah. I mean, what do they think? It's like big sexual dimorphism, like as a lobby group or something,
Yeah.
like big pharma.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're like, gotta watch out for big sexual dimorphism. Yeah.
Yeah, it's bizarre,
It is
especially
bizarre.
because it's a bit of a reversal, right? I mean,
Hmm.
so what's like one of the craziest or maybe one of the first claims that you heard that you were just like, that doesn't seem right, or you wanted to find out if it was right because it's sort of new information about sex differences?
I think the one that fascinated me the most was the claim that male and female are social constructs.
Mm-hmm.
And many think that that's not a very common claim, but as we know, it's become a very common claim throughout social media, throughout political institutions, throughout legal institutions and businesses sometimes. I mean, it's in academia, it's just spread a lot. And so when I first started hearing that around 2017, that's when I really started doing research on, like, well, what's the foundation for sex? What are the origins of sex? Um, what are the sexes? Like, how do we define them? And what does biology say about that? And the further I went down, the more I got into the peer-reviewed biology literature, and it came to the evolutionary biology, and then the developmental biology. And I just basically, wanted to find the foundation and see how something that is so evident to us just from observation is defined and is where it's grounded. So we could also get into that if you wanted to, just kind of into the science of that. But yeah, that was one really interesting. claim.
Yeah. Well, first, I do want to ask you what about the gender paradox, like if you could sort
Mhm.
of explain that. So I haven't read this whole book yet. It is very big,
Yeah.
but you start by describing what you call the gender paradox. And
Mhm.
the book, I think, then sort of sets out to give an explanation for it and just sort of explore all sides of it. So could you explain what is the gender paradox?
So the gender paradox, its full name would be the gender equality paradox, and it's this social science phenomenon that was seen during the 80s and 90s and still continues to be seen today, where the countries with the most gender equality, according to the United Nations, experience the largest amount of so-called gender differences. And so we can look at a country like Norway, and we can look at the occupational preferences or self-reported occupational preferences for men and women there. And the largest differences in the world for occupational preferences versus like working with people or working with things more, those largest differences are found in Scandinavia, and particularly Norway, Sweden. And it's paradoxical because in countries that have the least amount of gender equality, like Iran, there's less sex differences there. So, for instance, uh, around 65% of science graduates in Iran are women, whereas, like in Norway, it's a lot smaller. Like the percentage of science graduates or engineering graduates specifically in like Norway is roughly around 20% or so that are women. And so this paradox was really curious to me, and I wanted to explore that. And so what the book does is it takes you through first the uh, main ideology of our culture right now, which I call social constructionism, which is the idea that whether it's body types or behavior or psychology is constructed from the culture and that it changes over time. And then what it does, so it outlines that ideology and it goes through and then explores the biological, psychological, and social variables that impact the differences between men and women, all the way from infancy to adulthood, and then how that might impact people's interests or occupational preferences. So it's a book that explores biological variation and psychological variation, and also celebrates the variation. It makes sure that it really describes the full variation and doesn't just focus on stereotypes. I have a whole chapter called Gender Stereotype Pathology in that book, and so it explores the harms of gender stereotypes and how certain stereotypes may lead people to different interests that they might not be best fit for and things like that. So um, you'll find just a lot of information in that book. It's like just an exploration, and then every page also has peer-reviewed citations listed there in the footnotes, so that helps too, just to for deeper understanding.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's well cited. And yeah, you emphasize that, we can embrace biology and move beyond the rigid definitions of gender, and that we can embrace biology and accept all people for how they present and express themselves in that. So
Right.
that's very clear. You have a very just it's very obvious that you're coming at it from a compassionate yet dispassionate view. So
Right.
that's
I
mhm.
think that's really important to balance that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because um, often in scientific inquiry or scientific endeavors, people might detach themselves from being compassionate, and I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think there's a good quote from a famous neuroendocrinologist, Robert Sapolsky. He said that you don't have to choose between being compassionate and being scientific, and I think it's really, really powerful. Some people also focus too much on compassion sometimes, where they just deny the science, and that is a problem that we see today too. And so you definitely have to balance those two, and I think that's really important, and something I try to do a lot.
Mhm. Yeah. So I do have some questions about the gender equality paradox. That's
Yeah.
what it's called, right?
Yep.
So Is that based off of one study or many studies that the differences would increase in when with higher rates of equality?
It's from many studies. The studies come from multiple disciplines. So for instance, there's one often cited study that looks at the occupational preferences. It's by Stowett and Gary. And there's also some from personality psychology. Uh, in fact, there's a handful from personality psychology where they take the Big Five personality model and they look at personality differences across the world, across 50 nations with hundreds of thousands of participants, and they do it through self-report evaluation. So they're basically seeing what people report their personality uh, types to be through these questionnaires, through these long questionnaires. And so what they find is that the personality differences are larger in gender equal nations compared to less gender equal nations. And then some of the psychological differences when it comes to occupational preferences tend to be larger in gender equal nations. Um, Now, what they haven't necessarily found is what the exact specific cause is. And I think obviously it would be a multivariate cause, just a lot of variables that affect those occupational preferences and affect those personality differences. I think it's definitely a mix of biology and society and culture, which I talk about in the book. But I think sometimes um, sometimes we can ignore biological explanations too much. So my premise is we should just integrate the two, integrate biology and psychology and sociology, and understanding how all those variables interact. So yeah, that's where the paradox comes from in terms of the literature. It's a pretty wide diversity of literature, and I am really looking forward to like how that develops over time and what they find, and perhaps they can kind of narrow down the causes even more and understand that, because uh, it is important to uh, make sure that nobody is excluded from occupations that they want to go into or feel like they're working in a hostile environment or being discriminated against. You know, it's really important that we allow for people's free expression when it comes to occupation and interests too.
Mhm. Yeah, it's definitely clear that, you're not saying that women shouldn't go into certain fields or anything, but I
Right.
do think people take it that way sometimes. And I want to ask you kind of what the social constructivists would say to this in answer to this paradox. But I also
Hmm.
wanted to ask, I mean, when I was reading, I did have, some questions in my mind about sort of how those studies were carried out in some of the lower equality countries. Like, well, you mentioned
Hmm.
Iran. Just to clarify, I mean, do women currently get college degrees in Iran?
Yeah, they do, but there's just a lot of the reason why that, for instance, there was more science graduates there is one reason that the literature explained was that potentially it's an economic variable that's affecting
Okay.
some of their choices there. For instance, it, they don't have as many options necessarily in Iran compared to Norway or Sweden, and so they hypothesized that perhaps the reason why there's such a large sex difference there, or there's less of a sex difference there in Iran, is potentially because women choose to go into those occupations partially for economic considerations, uh, to get to have more opportunities because they don't have as many opportunities in terms of other jobs or other fields. So it's kind of more of a narrow, and so that's one hypothesis.
Okay.
Um, mhm.
So the idea is kind of that if you have less or fewer external constraints, that it might allow something more innate to kind of flourish up. And
Right. That's the basic idea. That if you try to take away if you take away the social and cultural impediments to people's free expression, that the underlying biological predispositions mediated by that environment will then allow for maximum variation to
Mhm,
occur.
mhm.
And I think it's a good argument. I think it just needs even more continual exploration to kind of narrow it down, because I wouldn't say that it's 100% solidified that the cause would be biological. But I think there is good evidence that biology plays a part in that, and especially when you take out social constraints and you maximize people's opportunities. I think that's, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, okay. I mean, so feminists would probably have a bit of a reaction to this, right? I
Yeah.
know that I have, spent a long time sort of in feminist communities learning about feminism, and the earlier things that I learned was social constructivism.
Mhm.
They are actually talking about the idea, and you mentioned this in your book, that truly all of the differences, even some physical, I mean, I can't imagine how you would say like a beard is a social construct, but that even like size differences are due to cultural factors.
Mhm.
So, and then they would in turn think that it was sexist to actually deny that. So, what would they say? What
Right.
do they say to these ideas? Sort of
What
the
do
social constructivists or the
oh
feminists?
to the physical, to the idea that it's physically
Yeah,
so.
the idea that that gender is not purely a social construct.
Yeah, I think that I think I have your question right. I think that feminists have a very important tool when it comes to social constructionism, in that social constructionism is great at breaking down rigid forms of belief or attitudes, right, about people's bodies or people's roles in society, and breaking those down. And I think there's a really valuable tool there. I think oftentimes it's applied too far when it comes to even what we're seeing now, when they're saying that even male and female are socially constructed. I know many feminists are pushing back against that,
Mhm.
particularly radical feminists or gender critical feminists pushing back against that. But then there is definitely a wing of social constructionism that goes beyond just the behavior and the psychology and into the body. And they say that, well, the way we divide male and female bodies is socially constructed. Like the lines dividing male from female is socially constructed. And
Mhm.
that blurring of the lines is what we're seeing a lot now. And that was also a big focus in the gender paradox, was exploring that blurring that was
Mhm.
happening.
Yeah, shall we
So
get into that and sort of
yeah,
you can explain why that's happening or what you hear from people who are blurring that line, and what
kind of how to respond.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the most common, let's see. So let's lay it out like this. So the argument is called the sex spectrum. You'll hear this a lot. And there's three main principles to the sex spectrum. There's a biological principle, there's a social principle, and a political principle. Now, the biological principle states uh, that biological sex exists on a continuum beyond male and female. And so right now we'll just focus on the biological principle. So there's a few strategies that they use when they're arguing that male and female exist on a continuum. The first one is they detach sex from its functional reproductive role of, of the gametes that you produce, the sex cells that you produce, sperm and egg. They detach it from that, and then they say that sex is just a mix of characteristics. And then, so they'll say, oh, males are defined through, or we define males through XY, through testes, penis, all these different characteristics, facial hair, the high muscle mass, low voice, they're taller. They take all these traits and then they say, well, look at people who don't fit this mold, who don't fit these specific mix of traits. And so they'll point to intersex conditions, and they'll try to use intersex conditions as a way to deconstruct their own definition, or to show that their own definition that they're using is too narrow for male and female. And so what's happening here is a sleight of hand trick, where they're conflating sex characteristics, or the different ways that body types can look, with sex itself. So what they're doing is they are describing the shape or the body types of males of individuals within the male and female categories, rather than describing the categories themselves of male and female.
Mhm.
And so I mentioned like intersex conditions. So an example of this sleight of hand trick would be to say that females are only XX and that they have all these certain characteristics. And an activist would come and say that no, some males have XX chromosomes also. And so they would say, see, the categories of male and female are socially constructed. Now they miss the point that the only reason we can say that somebody who has XX chromosomes is a male is because of reproductive role, whether they develop a body that supports sperm or a body that supports eggs. And so, for instance, with the cases where an individual may have XX chromosomes and develop as a male, we define them as male because they develop a body that supports sperm. And the same thing can occur with the inverse with XY females, which is another very, very rare intersex condition. And we can define them precisely as females because they develop a body that is organized or supports ova. And so when you realize that what they're doing is they're conflating sex characteristics with sex, then you can really see how the magic trick is done. And so yeah, that is one portion of their argument where you just detach sex from reproductive role, and then you conflate sex characteristics with sex. I want to go briefly, just briefly into the evolutionary biology of what sexes are and kind of give some background to that. So yeah, so the sexes are fundamentally reproductive roles. And a reproductive role is just an evolutionary strategy for forming a new individual. And so in most higher order organisms within plants and within animals, there are only two reproductive roles. One role is the one that produces few large sessile gametes with a lot of genetic material. That's the female. And then the other role is the one that produces many small, fast gametes with a lot less genetic material, and that's the male. And so the origins for male and female can be traced back to those two gametes, those two mechanisms for forming a new individual. And the reason why we have differences in our reproductive systems in the first place with males and females is because gametes way, way back in evolutionary history diverged into just two forms, two different sizes and two different forms, many small motile gametes, few large sessile gametes, and those differences then informed the way that organisms developed in terms of their body types. And so the reason why we have male and female reproductive systems is because those evolved directly from those differences in gametes, in the sizes of the gametes, to help in producing and releasing those gametes. And so if we trace sex, if we trace like the sex characteristics and all the differences between males and females and on the level of body, we trace that back all the way, we get to just the two different gamete types. And that's the same across all species who reproduce through the fusion of two gametes of differing size. That's called anisogamy, which just means unequal fusion of gametes. And so the cool thing is what I've found is that we can define male and female the same way across all these species. And the answer is through gamete type. So I'll give you an example of a really cool species. So there's a species, seahorses, and they have just two sexes, males in separate individuals and females in separate individuals. Well, a curious thing happens with male seahorses. They actually carry and birth the baby seahorses, which is usually a trait found in females. So you're like, well, how do we define them as male then? And the answer is we define them as male because they develop a phenotype or a body that supports small gametes. they produce sperm. And so because of that, they're males. Another interesting example is crocodiles. And crocodiles, they have an interesting way of determining sex in their species. They just have male and female, just like us. But instead of chromosomes, which ultimately help develop our sex, crocodiles use temperature sex determination. So there's a range of temperatures where the egg incubates that it will develop as a male, or a range of temperatures where it will develop as a female. And so males develop around 34 degrees Celsius, that range, like 34 and above, and then females develop around 30. And so in crocodiles, we wouldn't say that every single temperature value is a sex. That would mean that crocodiles would have infinite sexes. And this is an excellent point that Dr. Emma Hilton, developmental biologist, has been making too. And it's really cool once you realize that, oh, the sexes are not defined by chromosomes necessarily. They're not defined by sex characteristics. They're not defined by their temperature values at which they develop. They're ultimately defined by the phenotype they develop for the production of gametes, sperm or egg. So crocodiles, males develop as the sex that produces the small gametes, and the female crocodiles are the sex that develop as and produce the large gametes. So that's kind of what the sexes are fundamentally, is reproductive roles. And I've been looking at the evolutionary biology literature on the evolution of sex, and like, why do we have just two gametes? Why don't we have more than two? In fact, there's some species of fungi that reproduce through like multiple different types of gametes. But the reason why we have two gametes from the literature, it's been talking about just for the past few decades, they've been looking at models for why we only have two gametes and why we only have two sexes. And they've found that with the rise of more complex organisms, there's this trend toward the divergence of just two gametes into differing sizes, where the more complex an organism gets, the more likely their reproductive mechanisms their gametes will differentiate and basically evolve into more extreme versions of themselves. So where in the evolutionary past, you may have had a lot of different gametes, like large gametes, intermediate gametes, and small gametes. Over time, what was selected for was the extremes, the really, really large gametes with a lot of the genetic material, so they can survive a lot longer. They just can't move as far. And then the many small gametes, which have less genetic material, they can move really fast and they can seek out the large gametes. And so what happens is, because of that, what's called disruptive selection, which drives them to either extreme, the intermediate gametes go extinct. So all those different sizes that you might see in older organisms, they just go extinct because they're not as evolutionary beneficial in a lot of these environmental circumstances for the reproduction and survival of the lineage. And so that's kind of the basic crash course on evolutionary biology and why we have only two sexes in most complex species.
Right before this, I watched a video that I wanted to look up after you talked about it in your book because it sounded so crazy. It was a Teen Vogue YouTube video.
Oh, yes.
Remember this video?
Yes,
You
I
referenced it
do.
in the book, and you said that it had like, tens of thousands of thumbs down and like a couple hundred thumbs up. So I really wanted to go check this out and see.
Yeah, saying how it's like, oh, sex is defined like by our social and political spheres, and
Right.
it exists on a spectrum. And yeah, I remember that. I think I had a video on that too. Like that was that was a fascinating video to.
Yeah, I mean, it made me kind of mad because it was like, even I knew they were talking bullshit, and I'm not a scientist. I'm just learning about this stuff. I mean, I know more about it now from having been in this debate than I ever thought I would. But, they were saying things like, I think they were mostly using intersex to sort of expand out as though that applies to that changes the way everyone is. That because
Right.
individuals exist, they're that sex is a spectrum. But I did have one specific question about the intersex, because they claimed in that video that it's as common as green eyes and red hair. Is that true?
Right. That's a common, yeah. So see, the thing with what their claim is that it's partially true and partially not. And it depends on how you define intersex. So
Okay.
what they do is they'll lump in conditions, sex development conditions that wouldn't even fit a real clinical description of intersex. So for example, the statistic that they cite most often is 1.7% for intersex. And this, for lay people, it makes people think, oh, so there's a lot of people who aren't actually male or female. Well, if you do a study of the statistics and look at the National Institutes of Health statistics, and also where the statistics come from originally, you'll see that 1.5% of the 1.7% comes from a condition that doesn't even produce any sex ambiguity at all. It just produces overproduction of androgens in males and females. That condition is called late onset congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And that makes up 1.5% of the 1.7%. And those people are clearly definable as male and female.
Okay.
And most are even fertile. Like they can produce children.
And
But
what's an androgen?
yeah, an androgen is just it's usually called a male sex hormone, but males and females both have androgens, just to differing degrees. There's different types of androgens too. So there's, for instance, testosterone is an androgen. Another molecule called super T or dihydrotestosterone is an androgen. And so they're involved in stress responses too. They're involved in masculinization. And so it's one reason why it's called a male sex hormone, because they're just much, much higher usually in males. But that condition, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which overproduces androgens, comes from the adrenal glands, which sit on your kidneys. And they regulate the amount of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and aldosterone, which regulates the salt retained in your kidneys. So if you overproduce androgens from the adrenal glands, you can develop that condition, congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And so in some females, if it overproduces androgens too far, you can get to where it will masculinize the genitalia, where you might have growth of the clitoris or fusion of the labia and those kinds of things. But there's still people with these conditions develop as males and females. So it's still clearly defined there. So that's 1.5%, or at least the late onset version is. And you go in deeper and you see that only 0.2% of births result in sex development conditions, only 0.2%. And then you go even deeper and you find that only 0.02% result in any ambiguity whatsoever, or a mismatch of genotype, your chromosomes, and your phenotype, your body. It's like an XY female or an XX male. So that's only like 0.02% of cases. The reason why it's important to know the statistics is because people often conflate the numbers. It can lead to misapplication of funding. It can make these medical conditions seem much more common than they actually are, which can negatively impact medical treatment and people's understanding of the conditions. So yeah, it's important to know the statistics and to know that when we look at each of those conditions and break it down, that we can clearly define male and female still, which is through reproductive role.
Okay.
So, even if you have an atypical body type, or a sex development condition, you still develop as a male or female. And I think it's really important to recognize that for medical treatment, and psychological health, and
Wow, it's so interesting. And I do feel like I have a million more questions for you, but I don't want to go on and on. So I'll ask you one more, which is just sort of about your experience in speaking about this stuff. Have you received backlash or any sort of negative reaction?
For the most part, it's been incredibly positive, just like an outpouring of like encouragement and support and collaboration too. It's been amazing. I have received just some pushback. It kind of tends to appear in certain waves. So if some activist who disagrees with me has somewhat of a following and they quote tweet one of my tweets, I'll get like a pile on sometimes, and see a bunch of active, yeah. Um, but for the most part, it's been really really good. And my strategy is even with comments that might be counterproductive or condescending or something like that. I'll try to mostly respond with just facts and non-emotion, or maybe joke around sometimes, but like I try to keep it balanced. And um, my goal is to continually bring clear scientific information and back it up with sources. And that's why I don't get involved in arguments a lot with people in threads, because it is often a waste of time just to argue a lot on Twitter and social
Mhm.
media. So I
Yeah.
found the best way, the most effective way to communicate is often quote tweeting people who are saying something that is not true, like saying that male and female are social constructs. So I'll quote tweet them and I'll lay out why male and female are not social constructs, and then often present some peer-reviewed literature to back that up. So that's what I found is the most beneficial, just a quote tweet like that. I've also changed like the notification settings on Twitter, just so I like when I first got Twitter and started posting, I immediately turned off the notifications on my phone so it doesn't blow up. And then I went even further and looked at the notifications in Twitter and like the quality filter settings, and just tweaked that so I don't just, if I'm looking through notifications, I just don't see a lot of hateful comments a lot, because you got better things to do in your life than look at hateful comments. I
Yeah,
mean,
definitely.
it's good to look at like constructive criticism, but not stuff that's just, so I just blow most of that stuff off.
I think you help a lot of people understand and you give a lot of resources for other people to use as part of their discussions and arguments. So just let us know where we can find you online, where people can find your work.
So you can find me on Twitter at ZAE Lefty with a Y, so ZAELEFTY, and then you can find uh, my videos on the Paradox Institute. You can just type in Paradox Institute YouTube, and you'll find it there.
And I'll link those below this video. So now we're going to go ahead and do something pretty fun, which is talk
Mhm.
about the ACLU's recent
Oh yes, I'm
tweet
looking forward
thread.
to it.
So that is going to be a separate video. So if you're watching this, you can find that video also on my channel. But this concludes our interview portion. So Zach, thank you so much. That was really interesting.
Thank you for having me.